Why would a people, subjects of the most powerful empire on earth, rise in furious rebellion over tea that had been made cheaper than ever before? How could a clandestine society of smugglers, men whose fortunes were built in the shadowy coves of New England, become the financial architects of a revolution by destroying a cargo that, by all logic, should have been their commercial salvation? The story of the United States of America does not begin in a grand hall of philosophy or on a bloody battlefield. It begins in the cold, dark waters of a Boston night, with the sharp crack of hatchets against wood and the quiet splash of ruined fortunes. It begins with an act of magnificent, calculated vandalism. This is the story of how a protest over a corporate bailout and a three-penny tax escalated into a war that would tear an empire apart and give birth to a new kind of nation, a nation conceived not in loyalty, but in defiance. Boston, in the autumn of 1773, was a city holding its breath. For over a decade, the air had been thick with the rhetoric of rights, the sting of taxes imposed from 3,000 miles away, and the simmering resentment of a people who felt they were being treated not as Englishmen, but as provincial cash registers for a distant crown. The city was the jagged nerve ending of the American colonies, a place where royal authority and colonial ambition rubbed raw against each other. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the so-called Boston Massacre, each was a wound, a scar on the body politic. Each had been met with protests, boycotts, and a stubborn, unyielding refusal to bend the knee. Now a new crisis was sailing toward them across the Atlantic, carried in the holds of 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. It came in the form of tea, but it was never just about the tea. The British East India Company, a corporate behemoth that was the 18th century equivalent of a global superpower, was teetering on the brink of collapse. It was the original too big to fail. Its warehouses in London were overflowing with £17 million of unsold tea, a mountain of fragrant leaves that represented a mountain of debt. To save this vital pillar of the British economy, Parliament, led by Prime Minister Lord North, devised what it saw as a brilliant solution, the Tea Act of 1773. On its face, the act seemed like a gift to the American colonists. It allowed the East India Company to ship its tea directly to the colonies and sell it through its own chosen agents, bypassing the London auctions and the middlemen. This slashed the price, making the company's tea significantly cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that flooded the colonial market. It was a move designed to simultaneously save the company, undercut the smugglers, and entice the Americans into finally, implicitly, accepting Parliament's right to tax them. They were offering a golden cage baited with cheap luxury, but Bostonians saw the trap. For them, the Tea Act was a Trojan horse. The cheap price was irrelevant, the principle was everything. The act preserved the small symbolic Townshend duty on tea, a tax the colonists had been boycotting for years. To buy the tea, even at a bargain, was to swallow that tax and concede the entire argument. It was to admit that Parliament held the power to tax them without their consent, without a single American representative sitting in its halls. Furthermore, by granting the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade, the act threatened to wipe out the local merchants and the powerful smugglers who formed the backbone of the resistance movement. Men like John Hancock, the wealthiest merchant in New England and a man whose signature would one day become a symbol of defiance, had made fortunes circumventing British trade laws. For him and others, this was not just a political fight, it was economic warfare. The empire thought it was trading in tea, but in reality it was trading in fire, and the port of Boston was the first spark in that fire. The true engine of the rebellion, however, was not in the counting houses of the wealthy, but in the smoky back rooms of Boston's taverns. Here, in places like the Green Dragon, a group of artisans, shopkeepers, and street politicians known as the Sons of Liberty plotted their response. Their leader was a man who seemed born for the role of revolutionary, Samuel Adams. Adams was a failure in almost every conventional sense. He had run his family's brewery into the ground and was a notoriously inept tax collector. but he possessed a singular, world-changing genius for political agitation. He understood the power of symbols, the language of the street, and the art of turning a grievance into a movement. He was the puppet master, the propagandist, the man who could channel the raw anger of the city into a focused political weapon. With his cousin, the brilliant lawyer John Adams, and the charismatic Dr. Joseph Warren, he began to prepare Boston not just for a protest, but for a confrontation. As the Dartmouth, the first of the tea ships, sailed into Boston Harbor on November 28th, a 20-day countdown began. By law, a ship had to unload its cargo and pay the required duties within that time, or the cargo would be seized by customs officials. This created a perfect theatrical deadline. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a native of Massachusetts but a staunch loyalist, was determined to see the law enforced. He refused to grant the ship's clearance to leave the harbor with the tea still on board. He was a man trapped by his own principles, a symbol of royal authority who believed that to yield an inch was to lose the entire colony. His stubbornness was the anvil upon which Samuel Adams would forge his plan. Mass meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in the city, drawing thousands of citizens. The rhetoric grew hotter, the crowds larger. They were not a mob, they were a citizenry deliberating its fate. The question hung in the air, sharp as the winter wind. What would you choose, submission and cheap goods, or a devastating fight for the right to decide your own fate? The plan that emerged was not a spontaneous riot, but a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater, a special operation in disguise. The Sons of Liberty needed to do more than just prevent the tea from landing. They needed to make a statement so bold, so shocking, that it would be impossible to ignore. They needed to destroy the property of the crown in a way that was both disciplined and defiant. The decision was made to disguise the participants as Mohawk Indians. This was not a serious attempt to fool anyone. Everyone would know who was responsible. Rather, it was a deeply symbolic choice. The Mohawks represented a primitive, American identity, distinct from the corrupt, over-civilized world of the British Empire. It was a way of saying, "We are not your subjects anymore. We are something new, something wilder, something born of this continent." The clock was ticking down to December 16th, the final day. The city was a powder keg, and Samuel Adams held the match. The stage was set for a party, but the guests of honor would be rebellion and the specter of war. This was a calculated risk, a gamble for the soul of a continent. So, looking back, who was the real instigator of the conflict? Was it the radicals like Samuel Adams pushing for a confrontation, or the Crown enforcing a law it believed was just? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. The final desperate hours of negotiation had failed. On the afternoon of December 16th, 1773, the Old South Meeting House was filled to overflowing, with thousands more standing outside in the biting cold. The crowd was a cross-section of Boston society, merchants and mechanics, lawyers and laborers, all united by a shared sense of impending crisis. The owner of the Dartmouth, Francis Roch, had made one last futile appeal to Governor Hutchinson to allow his ship to sail back to England with its cargo of tea intact. As dusk fell over the city, Roch returned to the meeting house with the governor's final refusal. The law must be upheld, the tea must be landed, the tax must be paid. A hush fell over the massive assembly. All eyes turned to Samuel Adams. He rose and spoke the prearranged signal, a simple phrase that would echo through history. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was the spark that lit the fuse. From the gallery, a war whoop erupted, a sound that was both chilling and electrifying. It was the signal. The Mohawks were on the move. Out of the meeting house and through the darkened streets poured hundreds of men, their faces smeared with soot and paint, blankets draped over their shoulders, hatchets and axes in their hands. They were not a disorganized mob. They moved with a purpose, a disciplined silence that unnerved those who watched from the windows and doorways. They were divided into 3 groups, each assigned to one of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, all moored at Griffin's Wharf. The operation was a model of revolutionary efficiency. The participants, a mix of artisans, apprentices, and even some prominent citizens, had sworn an oath of secrecy. They were a band of brothers united in an act of mass civil disobedience that bordered on treason. As they reached the wharf, a huge crowd of spectators, numbering in the thousands, gathered to watch in near total silence. The air was thick with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. This was the point of no return. The Mohawks boarded the ships, their demands simple and direct. They asked the captains for the keys to the cargo holds. There was no resistance. The crews, some of whom were sympathetic to the colonists' cause, stood aside. The work began immediately. Heavy chests, each weighing nearly 400 pounds, were hoisted from the dark, cramped holds onto the moonlit decks. The crisp night air filled with the sharp, rhythmic sound of splitting wood as the men broke open the crates with their hatchets. Then, with a heave, they dumped the contents, over 92,000 pounds of East India Company tea, into the frigid, murky water of Boston Harbor. The tide was low, and soon the tea began to pile up in the shallows, forming strange, fragrant islands in the icy brine. The discipline of the participants was astonishing. This was a political statement, not a riot for personal gain. One man, caught stuffing tea into his pockets, was summarily stripped of his coat and kicked out of the proceedings, a stark warning to any others who might mistake this for simple looting. The only other property damaged was a single padlock, which was anonymously replaced the next day. For 3 hours, the work continued under the pale winter moon. The men on the ships worked in a feverish, focused silence, while the crowd on the shore watched, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. What made the scene even more surreal was the presence of British warships, including the formidable HMS Active, anchored just a few hundred yards away. Their cannons could have obliterated the wharf and the participants in minutes. Yet they remained silent, their guns cold. Admiral John Montagu, the commander of the Royal Navy Squadron, had the firepower but lacked the legal authority to act without a formal request from the civilian governor, and Hutchinson was effectively a prisoner in his own city. The king's authority had evaporated in the salty air. An empire's power is not just in its cannons, but in the willingness of its subjects to obey. That night, obedience died in Boston. When the last of the 342 chests had been splintered and its contents sent to a watery grave, the Mohawks quietly dispersed, melting back into the city's crooked lanes. They washed the paint from their faces and hid their hatchets. They had destroyed an immense amount of private property, an act valued at over $1 million in today's currency. They had directly challenged the might of the British Empire and the financial interests of its most powerful corporation. As the city fell silent once more, a profound change had occurred. The argument was no longer about legal petitions and parliamentary debates. A line had been crossed. The colonists had moved from protest to active, physical resistance. They had shown that they were willing to do more than just talk. They were willing to act, to destroy, to sacrifice. Boston had thrown down a gauntlet that London could not possibly ignore. The act was a declaration written not in ink, but in the ruined leaves of tea floating on the tide. The news of this audacious defiance, carried by express riders on frost-covered roads, began to spread like wildfire, first through Massachusetts and then to the other 12 colonies. And as the story was told and retold, it grew in legend, becoming a founding myth of a nation yet unborn. The question now was not what Boston would do next, but how the lion, the British Empire, would respond to having its tail so brazenly twisted. The answer would come from London, and it would be written in fury and steel. When the news of the Boston Tea Party, a term that would only be coined decades later, reached London in late January of 1774, it did not arrive as a whisper of colonial discontent. It landed like a cannonball in the heart of the British establishment. The initial reports, carried by the ship Haley, owned by none other than John Hancock, detailed the methodical, organized destruction of the East India Company's property. The reaction was not one of mere displeasure, it was a paroxysm of imperial rage. For King George III and his government, this was not a protest over taxes. It was an act of open rebellion, a direct and insolent challenge to the sovereignty of Parliament and the authority of the Crown. The time for conciliation, for debate, for paternalistic warnings was over. Boston, the perennial troublemaker, had finally gone too far. The city had to be punished, broken, and made an example of for the other wavering colonies. The king himself wrote, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." The debates in Parliament were a storm of indignation. Voices of moderation, like those of Edmund Burke and William Pitt, who had long warned that a policy of coercion would only drive the Americans further away, were drowned out in a chorus demanding retribution. Burke argued prophetically, "The question is not whether you have a right to render your people miserable, but whether it is not your interest to make them happy." But his was a voice in the wilderness. The prevailing mood was one of fury. One member of Parliament declared that Boston ought to be knocked about their ears and destroyed. Another suggested it be razed to the ground. The government of Lord North, secure in its massive parliamentary majority, saw an opportunity not just to punish Boston for the destruction of the tea, but to fundamentally restructure the government of Massachusetts to surgically remove the cancer of colonial self-government once and for all. They would not just demand compensation, they would demand total submission. The result was a series of 5 legislative acts passed in rapid succession in the spring of 1774. In Britain, they were known as the Coercive Acts. In America, they were branded with a more visceral name, the Intolerable Acts. They were not designed to be just, but to be punitive. The first and most devastating was the Boston Port Act. It ordered the complete closure of the port of Boston to all commercial traffic, effective June 1st. The lifeblood of the city, its maritime trade, was to be choked off. The wharves would fall silent, the warehouses would stand empty, and thousands would be thrown out of work. The port would not be reopened until the East India Company and the Royal Customs Service had been fully compensated for the destroyed tea and the lost duties. It was an act of collective punishment, holding an entire city of 16,000 people hostage for the actions of a few hundred. The second blow was the Massachusetts Government Act. This law effectively annulled the colony's charter of 1691, a document that had granted Massachusetts a significant degree of self-government for generations. The act decreed that the upper house of the colonial legislature would no longer be elected by the lower house, but would be appointed by the Crown. Town meetings, the very crucibles of revolutionary sentiment, were restricted to 1 per year, and only then with the governor's permission. The power to appoint judges and sheriffs was transferred from the people to the royal governor. It was a constitutional decapitation, an attempt to replace democratic accountability with direct imperial control. It confirmed the colonists' worst fears, that Parliament believed it had the authority not just to tax them, but to extinguish their political rights at will. The goal was to make Massachusetts a docile child, but the effect was to make it an enraged enemy. To enforce these new laws, 2 more acts were passed. The Administration of Justice Act, which the colonists sardonically called the Murder Act, allowed a royal official accused of a capital crime in Massachusetts to be tried in another colony or in England, away from the passions of a local jury. To the colonists, this was a clear signal that British soldiers could kill Americans with impunity. The fourth act was a new Quartering Act, which gave military commanders broader authority to house their troops in private dwellings if suitable public quarters were not provided. Finally, though not officially part of the Coercive Act, the Quebec Act was passed at the same time and was viewed by the colonists as part of the same oppressive pattern. It expanded the boundaries of Quebec into the Ohio Valley, a region coveted by the American colonies, and granted religious freedom to Catholics, a move that inflamed the anti-Catholic sentiments of many Protestant colonists. To oversee this iron-fisted policy, the British government appointed a new military governor for Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. The message was unmistakable. Civil government was to be replaced by military rule. 4,000 British troops, the Redcoats, were stationed in Boston, turning the city into an armed camp. The city that had once been a city upon a hill, a beacon of Puritan liberty, was now an occupied territory. But London had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believed that by isolating and crushing Boston, they would intimidate the other colonies into submission. Instead, they created a martyr. The plight of Boston did not frighten the other colonies, it horrified them. They saw in the intolerable acts a blueprint for their own future subjugation. If Parliament could do this to Massachusetts, it could do it to Virginia, to Pennsylvania, to any of them. The punishment of one had become the cause of all. The chains being forged for Boston were seen as chains being forged for every American. Far from extinguishing the fire, the intolerable acts had poured fuel on it, transforming a local protest into a continental crisis. The call for a united response, a general congress of all the colonies, now became irresistible. The intolerable acts intended to isolate and break Massachusetts instead acted as a powerful catalyst for colonial unity. The closing of the port of Boston on June 1, 1774, was a moment of profound shock and solidarity throughout the 13 colonies. From South Carolina to New Hampshire, cities and towns marked the day with fasting, prayer, and the tolling of muffled bells. Cartloads of rice, flour, and other provisions began to flow into the besieged city from its sister colonies, a tangible expression of a shared fate. An attack on one was now truly considered an attack on all. The mechanism for this burgeoning sense of unity was a network that had been years in the making, the committees of correspondence. These committees, pioneered by Samuel Adams, were the nervous system of the revolution. They were shadow governments operating through letters and riders, sharing news, coordinating boycotts, and nurturing a common American identity in the face of British policy. Now this network buzzed with an urgent new purpose: to organize a unified continental response to the Crown's punitive measures. The call for a General Congress, a meeting of delegates from all the colonies, came loudest from the oldest and largest of them, Virginia. The Virginia House of Burgesses, a body that included men like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington, declared that the assault on Massachusetts was an assault on all of British America. They proposed that all colonies send representatives to a Congress in Philadelphia to consult upon the present unhappy state of the colonies. The idea was seized upon with enthusiasm. This was a radical step. For over a century and a half, the colonies had been separate entities, often bickering with one another over land claims, trade, and religion. They were Virginians, New Yorkers, Carolinians. The idea of being Americans was still a fragile and novel concept, but the intolerable acts had given them a powerful reason to overcome their differences, a common enemy and a shared threat to their liberties. In September of 1774, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, only distant Georgia abstained, gathered at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. This was the First Continental Congress. It was an extraordinary assembly of the finest political minds in North America. They were not, for the most part, wild-eyed revolutionaries seeking independence. They were lawyers, merchants, and planters, conservative men of property who still considered themselves loyal British subjects. Their goal was not to break from the empire, but to find a way to defend their rights within it. The spectrum of opinion was vast. On one end were the radicals like Samuel and John Adams from Massachusetts and Patrick Henry from Virginia, who believed that a conflict was inevitable and that the colonies must begin to prepare for war. Henry delivered a stirring speech that captured this new sense of national identity, declaring, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." On the other end were the moderates and conservatives, led by men like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania and John Jay of New York. They were horrified by the prospect of a violent break with Great Britain and sought a path of reconciliation. Galloway proposed a plan of union, an ambitious scheme to create an American colonial legislature that would have co-equal authority with Parliament on all matters concerning the colonies. It was a last-ditch effort to create a constitutional framework that could keep the empire together. The plan was brilliant, but it was ultimately defeated, though only by a single vote. The tide was turning against compromise. The delegates understood that words alone would not move the king or parliament. They needed to exert economic pressure to hit Great Britain where it would hurt most, in its wallet. The Congress therefore adopted a radical plan of economic coercion. They created the Continental Association, an agreement to implement a total boycott of British goods. Starting in December, they would not import anything from Britain. If their grievances were not addressed by the following September, they would also cease all exports to Britain. This was a declaration of economic war. To enforce it, the Congress called for the creation of local committees in every town and county to monitor merchants and citizens, to publish the names of violators, and to use public shaming and intimidation to ensure compliance. This was the true revolutionary act of the First Continental Congress. It was not a mere debating society, it was creating a parallel government, an infrastructure of rebellion that bypassed and defied royal authority. The Congress also adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document that, while professing loyalty to the king, firmly asserted that the colonists were entitled to all the rights of Englishmen and that Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent. Finally, they agreed to meet again in May of the following year, 1775, if their demands had not been met. It was a clear ultimatum. When the Congress adjourned in late October, the delegates returned home with a profound sense of both accomplishment and foreboding. They had forged a fragile unity and charted a course of common resistance. But they had also set the colonies on a collision course with the most powerful military machine on the planet. The shadow of a government had been formed, but shadows offer no defense against bullets. The next step would have to be taken not in a hall of debate, but in the fields and armories of New England. The delegates in Philadelphia chose a path of confrontation, betting that economic pressure could force a political solution. Do you believe their choice was wise? Should they have pursued radical resistance or embraced a moderate compromise like Galloway's plan of union? Share your thoughts on this pivotal decision in the comments. While the politicians in Philadelphia debated declarations and boycotts back in Massachusetts, the situation was rapidly escalating from a political crisis into a low-grade war. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, found himself in an impossible position. He was the commander of the King's army, the symbol of British power, yet he was effectively a prisoner in Boston. Beyond the narrow neck of land that connected the city to the mainland, his authority had completely vanished. The countryside was in a state of open, organized rebellion. The Massachusetts Government Act, intended to dissolve the colony's self-government, had backfired spectacularly. The royally appointed officials were hounded from their homes, forced to resign in public ceremonies of humiliation. The colonists simply ignored the new regime and established their own provincial congress, which met in Concord and acted as the de facto government of the colony. It collected taxes, organized militias, and began to stockpile weapons and gunpowder. A revolution was happening in plain sight. Gage was a seasoned officer, but he was not a tyrant. He was acutely aware that his few thousand troops were vastly outnumbered by the potential militia of New England. He repeatedly wrote to London, warning that the situation was far more serious than they believed, and that he would need at least 20,000 men to enforce Parliament's will. His warnings were largely ignored. The government believed the colonists were all talk and bluster, a cowardly rabble that would scatter at the first whiff of gunpowder. This profound underestimation of their opponent's resolve was one of the British Empire's greatest blunders. An empire that ceases to understand the people it rules is an empire on the verge of collapse. Gage, caught between an intransigent government and a rebellious populace, decided to tread carefully. He hoped to avoid bloodshed, believing that a show of force, combined with targeted strikes to seize rebel munitions, could defuse the situation without igniting a full-scale conflict. His first attempt, in September of 1774, was the powder alarm. Acting on intelligence, Gage sent a detachment of redcoats to seize a large quantity of gunpowder stored in a powder house near Somerville. The mission was successful, and bloodless, but the reaction was volcanic. Rumors spread through the countryside like a brush fire that the British were marching, that Boston was being bombarded, that war had begun. Within hours, tens of thousands of militiamen from all over Massachusetts and neighboring colonies were on the march toward Boston, armed and ready for a fight. The spontaneous uprising shocked Gage. He had not anticipated such a rapid and massive mobilization. The militia eventually returned home when the true, more limited nature of the raid became clear, but the powder alarm served as a dress rehearsal for war. It demonstrated the Patriots' impressive ability to communicate and mobilize, and it hardened the resolve on both sides. In the wake of the powder alarm, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress urged all towns to organize and train special militia units, men who could be ready at a minute's notice. These were the Minutemen. They were not a professional army. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. But they were men who knew how to use a rifle, who were defending their own homes and land, and who were deeply committed to their cause. They began to drill on their town greens, and they continued to secretly gather military supplies, cannons, muskets, gunpowder, and lead, storing them in caches in towns like Worcester, and most importantly, Concord. The air in Massachusetts grew thick with paranoia and espionage. Both sides were operating extensive intelligence networks trying to discern the other's intentions. General Gage had his spies, but the Patriots' network was arguably better. It was a web of artisans and mechanics, men who moved freely through the city, listening in taverns, observing troop movements, and reporting back to the leaders of the resistance. At the center of this Patriot spy ring was a man of immense charisma and talent, Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a respected physician who treated patients on both sides of the conflict, giving him access to a wide range of information. His chief operative was a man whose name would become synonymous with a midnight warning, Paul Revere. Revere was a silversmith, but his true craft was connection. He knew everyone. He was a member of numerous clubs and societies, from the Freemasons to the Sons of Liberty. He was the vital link, the man who could take a piece of raw intelligence from Warren and disseminate it with lightning speed through a prearranged network of riders. As the winter of 1774 turned into the spring of 1775, the tension became unbearable. Gage was under increasing pressure from London to take decisive action, to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders, particularly Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying in Lexington. Intelligence reports pointed to Concord as the main repository of the colonist military supplies. A plan began to form in Gage's headquarters, a secret, nighttime march to seize the weapons at Concord and perhaps to capture Adams and Hancock along the way. But in a city of spies, there are no true secrets. The Patriots knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. The whispers had become a certainty. By mid-April of 1775, Dr. Joseph Warren's network of spies confirmed that the British were preparing for a major operation. The Grenadier and Light Infantry companies were being pulled from their regular duties, and longboats were being prepared for a nighttime amphibious crossing of the Charles River. The target was almost certainly the Patriot arsenal at Concord. On the night of Tuesday, April 18th, Warren received ironclad intelligence that the British march was imminent. He summoned two of his most trusted couriers, the silversmith Paul Revere and a tanner named William Dawes. They were to be the twin arrows of a warning shot across the countryside. Their mission? To ride to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that they were likely targets for arrest, and then to continue on to Concord to alert the militia that the British were coming to seize their supplies. To ensure the message got through, they would take two different routes. Dawes would take the longer land route, slipping past the British guards on the narrow Boston Neck. Revere would take the more direct but riskier water route, crossing the Charles River to Charlestown. As a final failsafe, Revere arranged a signal system with the sexton of the Old North Church. Two lanterns were to be hung in the church's steeple if the British were leaving by sea, and one if they were leaving by land. This signal was not for Revere himself, but for other Patriot riders waiting across the river in Charlestown, in case he was captured before he could even begin his ride. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. It was a simple code for a complex and dangerous night. Around 10 o'clock that evening, the 2 lanterns briefly flickered to life in the darkness of the steeple, casting a fleeting glow over the sleeping city and the silent graves of Copp's Hill, burying ground. The British were coming by sea. Revere was rowed across the river, his passage nearly intercepted by the looming shadow of the British warship HMS Somerset. Landing safely in Charlestown, he borrowed a horse and began his legendary ride into the darkness. It was a journey fraught with peril. The roads were patrolled by British officers sent out ahead of the main column to intercept any messengers. Revere was nearly captured just outside of Charlestown, but managed to evade his pursuers with a burst of speed. As he galloped through the Massachusetts countryside, he did not, as legend often claims, shout, "The British are coming." To do so would have made no sense. In 1775, everyone was still technically British. His warning was more precise and alarming. "The regulars are coming out." At every town and farmhouse, he roused the local militia leaders, setting in motion a chain reaction of alarm bells, signal guns, and more riders, fanning out into the night. The countryside was awakening. He reached Lexington around midnight, finding Adams and Hancock at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark. After delivering his urgent warning and being joined shortly after by William Dawes, who had arrived by his own route, they were convinced to flee for their own safety. Revere and Dawes, now joined by a young doctor named Samuel Prescott, who was returning home from a late-night courtship, decided to continue on to Concord. They had not gone far when they ran straight into a British patrol. Revere was captured. Dawes managed to escape, but his horse threw him, and he was forced to turn back. It was Samuel Prescott, the least famous of the three, who proved to be the hero of the final leg. He knew the local terrain intimately, and with a daring leap of his horse over a stone wall, he escaped the patrol and successfully carried the alarm the rest of the way to Concord. The mission was a success. The weapons at Concord would not be taken by surprise. As dawn broke on Wednesday, April 19th, the vanguard of the 700-man British column, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, marched into the town of Lexington. On the village green, they were met by a small, grimly determined line of about 77 militiamen, commanded by Captain John Parker. Parker was a veteran of the French and Indian War, a man dying of tuberculosis, and he was not looking for a fight. His orders to his men were practical, not heroic. Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. A British officer rode forward and ordered the assembled farmers to disperse. As the militiamen, vastly outnumbered, began to slowly back away, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired it. Was it a nervous militiaman, a jumpy redcoat, or a patriot provocateur hidden behind a wall? It doesn't matter. That single, anonymous shot was the spark that ignited a continent. It was the shot heard round the world. The British regulars responded with a volley of musket fire and then another, followed by a bayonet charge. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead or dying on the green, and 10 more were wounded. The British column reformed and, with a triumphant cheer, marched on toward Concord, leaving behind the first martyrs of a war that had just begun. The revolution was no longer a matter of taxes and principles, it was now a matter of blood. The British column reached Concord a few hours later, their victory at Lexington Green still fresh in their minds. But their primary mission was already a failure. Thanks to the midnight ride, the colonists had had hours to prepare. The most important military supplies, including the cannons and the bulk of the gunpowder, had been moved out of the town and hidden in the surrounding fields and swamps. The British troops could only vent their frustration by conducting a largely fruitless search. They burned a few gun carriages, threw some barrels of flour into the mill pond, and chopped down the town's liberty pole. It was a symbolic gesture, but the real prize had eluded them. While a small detachment of redcoats searched the town, the main body of troops secured the North Bridge, which spanned the Concord River. Across that bridge, on a hill overlooking the scene, the colonial militia was gathering. Their numbers were growing by the minute as companies from Concord and the neighboring towns of Acton, Bedford, and Lincoln arrived, drawn by the news of the bloodshed at Lexington. They were no longer just a small band of protesters, they were now an army of several hundred, and they were angry. From their vantage point they could see the smoke rising from the center of town. The rumor spread through their ranks that the British were burning their homes. Their commander, Colonel James Barrett, made the momentous decision to advance on the bridge and drive the British back. The Acton Company, led by a 30-year-old gunsmith named Captain Isaac Davis, took the lead. As the colonists marched down the hill toward the bridge, the small British force holding it fired a few warning shots and then a full volley. Isaac Davis and another militiaman, Abner Hosmer, fell dead. This time there was no hesitation, no confusion. The colonial officer, Major John Buttrick, yelled the order, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" The Americans unleashed a disciplined, withering volley of their own. The British, shocked by the ferocity and accuracy of the fire, broke and ran, retreating in disarray back toward the main body of their troops in the town. It was a stunning moment. For the first time, American colonists had fired on the King's troops in a pitched battle and forced them to retreat. The embattled farmers had stood their ground, and the Empire had blinked. By noon, Lieutenant Colonel Smith realized his position was untenable. The captured supplies were negligible, and the entire countryside was now swarming with angry militiamen. He gave the order to begin the long 16-mile march back to the safety of Boston. That retreat would become a living nightmare. The road from Concord to Boston became a 20-mile-long shooting gallery. The formal, linear tactics of the British Army were useless in this new kind of war. Thousands of militiamen, now numbering close to 4,000, swarmed along the route. They did not form up in neat lines in the open. They fought as they hunted, using the landscape as their greatest weapon. They fired from behind stone walls, from inside barns, from the cover of trees and ridges. They were a phantom army, striking and then melting away, inflicting a steady, bloody toll on the marching column of redcoats. This was not warfare as the British understood it. It was, in their view, a savage and cowardly form of combat. For the Americans, it was simply survival. The British soldiers, exhausted, thirsty, and running low on ammunition, began to panic. Their orderly march devolved into a near rout. They were saved from complete annihilation only by the timely arrival of a relief column of 1,000 men and 2 cannons, led by Lord Percy, which met them just outside of Lexington. Percy's cannons were able to keep the militia at a distance, allowing the battered remains of Smith's original force to rest and reform. But the respite was temporary. The running battle continued all the way to Charlestown, with the militia harassing the British column until the very end. As the sun set, the humiliated and bloodied survivors of the King's elite troops finally stumbled into the safety of the Charlestown Peninsula under the protective guns of the Royal Navy. The day that had begun with such confidence had ended in a catastrophic disaster. The British had suffered nearly 300 casualties, a staggering number. The Americans had lost fewer than 100, but the consequences were far greater than the casualty lists. In the days that followed, the militia did not go home. Instead, they stayed. From all over New England, thousands more arrived, forming a great spontaneous arc of armed men around Boston. The British Army was now trapped in the city, besieged by the very rabble they had set out to disarm. The protest was over. The war had begun. The colonists' use of guerrilla tactics was brutally effective, but seen as dishonorable by the British. What do you think? Was it a necessary act of asymmetric warfare by a weaker force, or a breach of the accepted rules of war at the time? Let us know your perspective in the comments. The bloodshed on the road from Concord had transformed the political landscape overnight. What had been a simmering dispute over rights and taxes was now an open war. The siege of Boston had begun. The city, occupied by General Gage's beleaguered army, was now a British island in a hostile American sea. Surrounding it was what could barely be called an army. It was a chaotic, sprawling collection of some 15,000 militiamen from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. They had no single commander, no unified supply system, and very little discipline. They were a force born of spontaneous outrage, held together by a shared sense of purpose. Their de facto commander was General Artemus Ward, an aging and infirm Massachusetts officer who did his best to impose some semblance of order on the sprawling encampments that stretched from Cambridge to Roxbury. The first days of the war were a stalemate, a tense standoff across the waters of the Charles River and Boston Harbor. While the makeshift army tightened its grip on Boston, the political wheels were turning once again in Philadelphia. In May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened as planned. But the circumstances were now radically different. They were no longer a body debating economic boycotts, they were the ad hoc government of a country at war. The delegates faced a monumental task. They had to create an army, find a way to pay for it, and forge a coherent strategy for a conflict that no one had truly wanted. One of the most pressing issues was leadership. The army besieging Boston was a New England army. To transform the conflict into a truly continental struggle, the other colonies, particularly the powerful southern colonies, needed to be fully committed. It was here that John Adams of Massachusetts made what was perhaps his most brilliant political move. He understood that to secure the support of Virginia, the largest and wealthiest colony, the commander of this new continental army had to be a Virginian. Rising in Congress, he nominated a man who had been attending the sessions in his Virginia militia uniform, a man who had distinguished himself with quiet dignity and a formidable presence. That man was the 43-year-old planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, George Washington. Washington was not the most brilliant military mind in the colonies, but he possessed other, more important qualities: unshakable integrity, immense personal courage, and a profound understanding that the army's survival was subordinate to civilian authority. He was the one man who could command the respect of all 13 colonies. His appointment was a masterstroke of political unity. A nation is not born from a single battle, but from the slow, difficult weaving of disparate threads into a single fabric. Before Washington could even reach his new command, however, the military situation in Boston exploded. In late May, British reinforcements arrived, bringing their total strength to over 6,000 men. Along with them came three of the King's most respected major generals: William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. The British High Command, now deeply embarrassed by the debacle at Concord, was determined to break the siege and crush the rebellion. Their plan was to seize the high ground surrounding Boston, particularly the hills of Dorchester to the south and the Charlestown Peninsula to the north, but the Patriots' intelligence network struck again. The rebels learned of the British plan and decided to preempt it. On the night of June 16th, a detachment of about 1,200 colonial troops under the command of Colonel William Prescott was sent to occupy and fortify Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. In a fateful error, possibly due to a misunderstanding of the orders, they bypassed Bunker Hill and instead dug in on the lower, more exposed Breed's Hill, which was closer to the city. When dawn broke on June 17th, the British were astonished to see a formidable 6-foot-high earthen redoubt crowning the hill, a fortress that had seemingly sprung from the ground overnight. General Gage and his commanders knew they could not allow this rebel position to stand. Its cannons could threaten the city and the fleet. They could have chosen to bombard the position from their ships or to land troops behind the rebels and cut off their retreat. Instead, General Howe, a man whose personal bravery often outweighed his strategic sense, chose the most direct and bloody option, a full-frontal amphibious assault. He was determined to teach the colonial rabble a lesson, to show them the awesome power of disciplined British regulars. He would march his men straight up the hill and sweep the rebels from their position with the bayonet. Twice, the British lines, weighed down by heavy packs under a blistering sun, advanced up the steep slopes of Breed's Hill, and twice they were met by a devastating, disciplined fire from the entrenched Americans. The colonial officers, low on ammunition, famously ordered their men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The effect was horrific. The British lines were torn apart, whole companies annihilated. The slopes of the hill were littered with the red coats of the dead and wounded. A third assault was mounted, this time with the British soldiers stripped of their heavy packs. By now, the American defenders were almost out of gunpowder. Their fire slackened, and the British finally swarmed over the ramparts, engaging in brutal, close-quarters combat. The colonists were forced to retreat, but they had inflicted catastrophic losses on the British. Out of 2,200 British soldiers who had taken part in the assault, over 1,000 were killed or wounded, a casualty rate of nearly 50%. It was a victory, but a victory that felt like a defeat. As General Clinton famously remarked, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, was a profound moral victory for the Americans. They had lost the ground, but they had proven to the world, and more importantly, to themselves, that they could stand and fight against the best soldiers of the British Empire. The war would be long, bloody, and anything but easy. The aftermath of Bunker Hill settled into a grim stalemate. George Washington arrived in Cambridge in early July of 1775 to assume command of the newly christened Continental Army. He was appalled by what he found. It was less an army and more a fractious mob of farmers with guns. There was little discipline, rampant disease, and a critical shortage of everything from uniforms to, most importantly, gunpowder. For the next 8 months, Washington's primary task was not fighting the British, but forging this raw material into a credible fighting force. The siege of Boston became a war of attrition, of small skirmishes and constant vigilance. The British, having learned a bloody lesson at Breed's Hill, were content to remain within their fortifications in Boston, while the Americans dug in and strengthened their siege lines. The city itself suffered, cut off from fresh food and supplies, with soldiers and civilians alike facing a long, cold winter. During this period of military stalemate, a different kind of battle was being waged, a battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. Despite the bloodshed at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, most colonists still clung to the hope of reconciliation. The idea of complete independence from Great Britain was still a radical, fringe concept. They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen, not for the creation of a new nation. This lingering loyalty to the crown was the single greatest obstacle to a unified war effort. What was needed was a weapon that could sever this emotional and psychological tie to the mother country, a weapon that could demolish the remaining arguments for reconciliation and make the case for independence not just logical, but necessary and inspiring. That weapon arrived not in the form of a cannon, but as a 47-page pamphlet. In January of 1776, a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine, with the encouragement of Benjamin Franklin, anonymously published a work titled Common Sense. Its impact was immediate and explosive. It became an instant bestseller, selling over 100,000 copies in a matter of months and being read aloud in taverns, churches, and army camps throughout the colonies. Paine's genius was in his style. He rejected the dense, legalistic arguments of the elite and wrote in a plain, fiery language that spoke directly to the common person. He attacked the very idea of monarchy, calling King George III the royal brute of Great Britain. He ridiculed the concept of an island ruling a continent, and he laid out a powerful visionary case for American independence, arguing that it was not just an opportunity, but a moral and historical imperative. "The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind," he wrote. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Common sense was an ideological bomb that shattered the old ways of thinking. It transformed the public conversation, making the once unthinkable idea of independence the new common sense of the matter. As Paine's words were firing the political imagination of the colonies, a daring military operation was being set in motion that would finally break the physical stalemate at Boston. Months earlier, Washington had approved a seemingly impossible plan conceived by a young, overweight bookseller-turned-soldier named Henry Knox. The plan was to retrieve the heavy cannons and mortars that had been captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York the previous spring. The problem was that Ticonderoga was 300 miles away, and it was the dead of winter. Knox, a man with no formal military or engineering training, but with an abundance of raw determination, led a small expedition that, through sheer grit and ingenuity, managed to transport 59 pieces of artillery weighing a total of 60 tons, across the frozen Hudson and Connecticut rivers and over the snow-covered Berkshire Mountains. They used heavy sleds pulled by teams of oxen, a Herculean feat of logistics that became known as the Noble Train of Artillery. By late February of 1776, Knox's cannons had arrived in the American camp outside Boston. Washington now had the firepower he needed to threaten the British Army and fleet. He devised a brilliant and audacious plan. Under the cover of darkness and a diversionary bombardment of the city from the west, he would fortify Dorchester Heights, a series of hills to the south of Boston that overlooked the city and the harbor. On the night of March 4th, more than 2,000 American soldiers worked silently and furiously, using prefabricated fortifications to construct 2 redoubts on the heights. When the sun rose on March 5th, the British, in a stunning repeat of the morning of Bunker Hill, awoke to find a powerful new American fortress looming over them. General Howe is reported to have exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." The British position was now completely untenable. The American cannons on Dorchester Heights could rain destruction on their army in the city and their ships in the harbor. Howe had 2 choices: order another suicidal frontal assault, this time uphill, into the face of heavy artillery, or evacuate. After a planned assault was thwarted by a providential storm, he made the only sane choice. On March 17, 1776, the entire British force of 11,000 soldiers, along with over 1,000 loyalist civilians, boarded their ships and sailed away from Boston, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Washington's army marched into the city in triumph. After nearly a year, the siege was over. It was a stunning, almost bloodless victory, achieved through a combination of logistical genius, strategic daring, and the powerful ideological shift that was sweeping the continent. Boston, the cradle of the Revolution, was free. The war was far from over, but the first chapter had ended in a decisive American victory. The stage was now set for the final, irrevocable step, a formal declaration of what was already a reality. The liberation of Boston was a tremendous strategic and morale-boosting victory, but it did not end the war, it simply moved it to a new theater. The British fleet, though forced to retreat, was still the most powerful in the world, and everyone knew they would return in force, likely to strike at the strategic heart of the colonies, New York City. In this tense atmosphere, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia faced their ultimate question. The war had been raging for a year. The Continental Army was a reality. The colonies were operating as a de facto independent nation, yet they remained, in theory, subjects of a king with whom they were at war. The situation was untenable. The time for petitions and reconciliation had passed. The final bridge to the old world had to be burned. The colonies had to formally declare their independence. The push for independence was led by a determined faction, with John Adams, Samuel Adams, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia at its forefront. They argued that a formal declaration was a practical necessity. It was needed to secure foreign aid, particularly from France, which would never support a mere colonial rebellion but might back a new nation fighting for its sovereignty. It was needed to solidify public opinion at home, to transform the conflict from a civil war into a war between 2 separate states, and it was needed to give the soldiers of the Continental Army a clear, unambiguous cause for which they were fighting and dying. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, acting on instructions from the Virginia Convention, introduced a simple, 3-part resolution that would change the course of history. It stated that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The resolution was electrifying. It forced the issue into the open, setting off a wave of furious debate. Some moderate delegates, representing colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, still hesitated, fearing the consequences of such a final, treasonous step. They argued for delay, hoping for a last-minute miracle of reconciliation. But the momentum was unstoppable. To allow time for the wavering colonies to receive new instructions from their home governments, the Congress postponed the final vote on Lee's resolution until early July. In the meantime, they took a crucial step. They appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration that would explain the reasons for their momentous decision to the American people and to the world. The committee consisted of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. The task of writing the first draft fell to the youngest member of the committee, the 33-year-old Virginian Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was known for his quiet demeanor and his powerful prose, what John Adams called his peculiar felicity of expression. Working in a rented room in Philadelphia, Jefferson composed a document that would become one of the most important statements of political philosophy in human history. He did not invent new ideas. Instead, he synthesized the core principles of the Enlightenment, drawing heavily on the work of the English philosopher John Locke and the Virginia Declaration of Rights, penned by George Mason. He distilled generations of thought about liberty, rights, and the purpose of government into a few immortal paragraphs. The Declaration's power lay in its assertion of universal human rights. It began not with a list of grievances against the king, but with a soaring preamble that declared certain truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It then laid out the radical principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. After establishing this philosophical foundation, the Declaration pivoted to a long and damning list of grievances against King George III, portraying him as a tyrant whose actions necessitated this separation. After review and minor edits by Adams and Franklin, the draft was presented to the full Congress on June 28th. The debates that followed were intense. The delegates made numerous changes, most significantly deleting a passionate condemnation of the slave trade, a compromise demanded by the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia. This tragic omission would haunt the new nation for generations, a stark contradiction to the noble ideal that all men are created equal. Finally, on July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted on Richard Henry Lee's original resolution. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained, but would approve it a week later. The political bond with Great Britain was officially severed. John Adams, in a letter to his wife Abigail, wrote that the day would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America, celebrated by succeeding generations with pomp and parade from this time forward forevermore. 2 days later, on July 4th, after further debate and refinement of Jefferson's text, the Congress formally adopted the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. The document was signed first by the Congress's President John Hancock, his signature famously large and bold, so that King George could read it without his spectacles. The story that began with an act of defiance over tea in Boston Harbor had reached its logical, revolutionary conclusion. The destruction of property had escalated into a war for survival, and that war had now been given a transcendent purpose. The protesters dressed as Mohawks had become the founding fathers of a new nation. They were no longer rebels fighting for the rights of Englishmen, they were Americans fighting for the birthright of all humanity. By signing the Declaration, these men were committing an act of treason against the British Crown. They were risking everything. As Benjamin Franklin is said to have quipped, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." They had staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on an idea that a nation could be founded not on the divine right of kings, but on the self-evident rights of its citizens. The war was far from won, but the United States of America had been declared to the world. The Founding Fathers, by challenging an empire, chose the path of war and uncertainty in the name of their principles. They wagered everything they had. Today, as we face our own challenges, their choice makes us think. Tell us, what do you think is more important for the prosperity of a nation? A guaranteed order, even at the cost of certain freedoms, or a risky freedom, which can lead to chaos? Write your answer in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us.